with more cyclists taken to the road, should they be held to the same standard as motorists and receive penalty points if they break the rules? Joining us from Kent is Cycling UK's Duncan Dollymore, who says no, they shouldn't, which we'd probably expect, alongside motoring lawyer Nick Freeman, who says cyclists should be able to be held accountable for bad behaviour.
Morning to both of you. You talk about toxic cycling, don't you, Nick Freeman? What is it? What do you mean by toxic cyclists?
Bad cycling, dangerous cycling. I mean, the problem at the moment is we've got about 8 million cyclists on the road, which is fantastic. I agree with all the comments you just made. But the time's come for regulation. For example, cyclists don't have to comply with any speed limits. There are no drink-drive limits, no drug-drive limits for cyclists. I mean, they can be prosecuted for being unfit. The penalties basically consist of financial penalties. And the biggest problem we have is, you see a bad piece of cycling, which is all very interesting, but we need to know who is cycling. You know, with a motorist, when somebody drives badly, you have a registration number and you have a means of tracing them. With cyclists, you don't really have a means of tracing them. And when there is if someone's prosecuted for dangerous cycling, which is a very serious offence for a motorist, you go to prison. The maximum penalty for a cyclist is £2,500, and that's if you can actually identify the person. So my view is, I welcome the increase to the cyclists. I think it's fantastic. I think Boris Johnson's on the right track, but we do need now to regulate. If there are 8 million on our roads, we need a proper infrastructure. We need to make the roads safer for everybody. We need to impose speed limits. I mean, can you imagine, you have a school area where motorists have to go at 20 miles an hour, but cyclists can go at 40 miles an hour. Cyclists, in my view, need to have bells on their cycle to warn pedestrians and other road users of their presence. And they need to have penalties with teeth. We have certain offences under the Road Traffic Act, such as dangerous cycling and inconsiderate cycling, but it's purely financial. There's no penalty point system, there's no disqualification. So we need to make it starting to count. And I think when we make people responsible and we can identify them, they cycle much more carefully and they contribute to road safety. All right,
let's speak to Duncan Dollymore. Duncan, so the fundamental point I think here is about identification. I mean, with a car, if you're in an accident with a car, or if you see a car driving erratically, you can take down the number plate, and you can 9 times out of 10 you can get to the driver responsible. But with a cyclist, there's complete anonymity. Surely there should be some sort of accountability and maybe some sort of registration system, either for the cyclist or the cycle. Is no bad thing.
Well, Nick dresses his arguments up in relation to parity because drivers are regulated. He says other people should be regulated, but we decide who's regulated depending on the risk they pose. So we don't regulate horse riders or people riding low-powered mobility scooters. We don't regulate children on scooters, and we don't regulate pedestrians or cyclists because the evidence shows that they do not statistically present a risk. Now, the reality is that there are tragic incidents that occasionally occur which garner the headlines, but I've never known Nick speak about this issue and quote any statistics. The reality is that 99.3% of pedestrians who die on our roads are involved in a collision with a motor vehicle. We have a situation where 41 cyclists died last year in collisions with drivers. No driver or car passenger was involved in a death in those and haven't been for recent years. The reality is, statistically, cyclists don't present that risk, so we don't regulate them the same way that we regulate drivers. If we chose to regulate them, we'd have to regulate people owning 25 million bikes in the UK, including 7 million children who ride bikes regularly.
Duncan,
are you going to have a situation?
Do you worry at all that, there are people, obviously there have been keen cyclists, we've seen them all, but there are more and more people who are new in a way to riding their bike on busy roads and things, because as we say, the number of, bike ownership has gone up a lot during lockdown. Do you think that there should be an introduction of sort of reminding people of the rules and how to behave? Because lots of people are getting in touch. Andy on Twitter says, yes, he agrees with Nick, actually, that if they don't follow the rules, though, they should be penalised. Barry says 100%. Yes, I can't remember the number of times I've been at my car at a red light and a cyclist just goes through it.
Okay, on the red light issue, 55 pedestrians have died in the last 10 years because car drivers have gone through red lights. Not a single person has had that consequence as a cyclist going through a red light. Cyclists jumping red lights is an annoyance. It's frustrating. it's behaviour that's irresponsible, but it doesn't present the risks that other behaviour by drivers presents. And that's the point that Nick always misses. Now, on your point about training, nobody is going to suggest that training for cyclists, education, the availability of the bikeability standard, which the Prime Minister announced last week, nobody's going to suggest that's not a good thing. But if you had compulsory registration and licensing for cyclists, that would deter children and new people to cycling from taking it up, which is why there isn't a single country in the world that has such a system. And I've never heard Nick explain how this would actually work and the practicalities of it.
Well, it's very easy to rely on statistics. I mean, in 2018, there were 482 people injured by pedestrians injured by cycling, by cyclists. 141 of those were seriously injured. Duncan says that going through a red light is an inconvenience. It's actually unlawful, Duncan, as I would expect as a former lawyer, you would know that. These aren't just mere trivialities. They're offences actually for motorists which would attract 3 penalty points. You do it 4 times in 3 years and you're off the road. Why should we differentiate with cyclists? Clearly the government intended, when it introduced the Road Traffic Act of 1988, it dealt with law for cyclists, and the huge problem is it didn't think about how we were going to identify them. There's absolutely no point in having law in place unless we can identify the culprits and hold them accountable. So it's not just an inconvenience, as you casually say, it's actually unlawful. And I think it's very important, Duncan, that we all uphold the rule of law. And so that is why I'm suggesting that all cyclists should be registered. There should be a registered tabard identifiable with that particular person, so that we know at any one time who is on a cycle. There should be a proficiency test. How can we let people loose on our roads with sharing very cramped road space without knowing that they are actually accountable in terms of road safety? They know the laws.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, Duncan, it's not just I mean, I'm seeing lots of, the motorised scooters have become really popular. You're not really meant to do those, ride those in the road. I see it all the time, and you get them electric bikes. There is a lot more on the road with 2 wheels now than there used to be. Do you not agree with some of what Nick is saying? That actually, people can break the law on 2 wheels, and we can't actually penalise them because we don't know who they are and where that bike came from.
I think it's a question of priorities and where you put your resources. Nick's right that cycling through a red light is illegal. It's not something we would ever condone. But when we start talking about this issue of identification, the Motor Insurers Bureau deals with the victims of uninsured drivers. They deal with about 130 deaths of people a year from uninsured hit-and-run drivers. What Nick's suggesting is that we ignore other road safety issues and prioritise our effort on emergency legislation to track and trace 25 million bikes and children who own those bikes, so that we have a registration system that's never worked anywhere else in the world, because he presents this as an issue of parity. What we should be doing is, who presents the most risk? What's the priority for road safety? And Nick says, well, it's easy to quote statistics. It's not easy to quote statistics. It's easy to be anecdotal like Nick is. It's more difficult to present a road safety argument when you come forward with the statistics about risk and who is injured and present a case for how you're actually going to run the system that he suggests we should run.
Nick, isn't there also a privacy issue here? If you think about the cars, it's the car that's registered, really. And when we see a number plate, that takes us to the car. You're suggesting some sort of tabard that would identify the cyclist. Surely there's privacy issues there, really. And also, you talk about young children as well. So that means young children who decided to go and ride their bike on their street would have some sort of number on the back of them that suddenly we will know exactly where, we could probably find out where they live and, when else we're going to see them riding their bike.
I think we have to have a debate about the age that young children are, in fact, safe to drive on the roads. And I think below a certain age, it'd have to be accompanied by a responsible adult who has passed a proficiency test. I don't know how we can seriously let people on our roads and expect them to comply with things like give way signs, stop signs, red lights, unless they know what the law is, because Duncan's now conceded that actually it's an offence to go through a red light. He talked about it initially as if it wasn't an offence. So, clearly, look, we're trying to make the roads safer. And I agree that the greatest risk, of course, is posed by motorists. Of course they are, but they are accountable. There's no privacy issue at all. If a motorist commits an offence and goes through, for example, a red light, the registered keeper receives a Section 172 notice. If he doesn't comply with that, he will be prosecuted for failing to give the information. he'll in fact receive 6 penalty points or disqualification upon conviction. His insurance premiums will rocket. So I don't object to a similar system for cyclists, but I think it would just logistically work more sensibly if we identified the cyclist rather than the bike, because pedal cycles, I imagine,
thank you
would change hands very frequently.
I mean, you've obviously both got very strong opinions on this, and it does reflect what our viewers are saying actually on both sides of the argument. Nick and Duncan, thank you both for pointing out the sort of the problems with it and the need for it as well. On Twitter, Cycle Nottingham, I think that gives it away on Twitter, says, would it actually make any difference? At what point would we get a ban? Who will police it? At what age would the penalty points start? Most people under 12 ride on the pavement with their parents. And we asked what you thought in a poll. Should cyclists get penalty points? And
well, I don't think you'll be surprised by this. 85% of you said yes, 15% said no. That was quite resounding.
yeah.